My name is Ryan McCormick, and I am a drug addict. I've been a drug addict for 10 years. My drugs of choice were heroin and cocaine. I was an intravenous user, meaning I shot up. Now, you wouldn't know this upon just meeting me on the street. I don't have a label on my forehead that says IV heroin user. But if you knew that when you met me, what would your perception of me be? What would you think about me? And what would your attitudes be? Or if you knew that I had an addiction, but I was in recovery for 3 years, what would you think of me then? Or if I was in recovery for 20 years, how would your perception of me change if you knew that? Drug abuse, drug addiction is very personal for me. I am in recovery 2.5 years. My own brother and best friend have both died because of their drug addictions. It's very personal for me. It's very personal for a lot of Americans. It's an epidemic, as many would say. The National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics have done some research on this, and they're a subsidiary of the National Institute of Health. They show that as many as 31.9 million people in this country have used an illegal drug in the past month. Now, admittedly, they take into account marijuana as being illegal. It is still illegal on the federal level. Some people don't see marijuana as severe as the other drugs, but they say half of those uses are marijuana. You take those out, it still leaves 16 million people in the last month that have used an illegal drug. And that's to the effect of heroin, cocaine, prescription pills, methamphetamines. 16 million people is 5% of the population. It's 1 out of 20 people. So on your next trip to Walmart or Meijer, getting groceries or toilet paper, chances are you'll see somebody in the last month that has used an illegal drug to the effect of heroin, methamphetamine, prescription pills, etc. So even with how prevalent it is, there's still a negative stigma, connotations, attitudes. The stigma associated with addiction is still very real. And there is ways to combat this. And that is my goal of this speech, is to inform people on how to combat that negative stigma, because I believe it can lead to a lot of positive change. My research shows 3 ways to combat the negative stigma of drug abuse and addiction. First way is understanding it as a brain disease and not a moral failing. Second way is using proper language that doesn't dehumanize an addict. The third way to reduce the negative stigma is what I'm doing today, speaking out and opening up. First way is understanding it as a brain disease. There's decades of research to show this. The National Institute for Drug Abuse has a lot of research that shows essentially what it is. It's the dopamine in your brain, and that's the feel-good chemical. When you use a drug, it releases that dopamine in your brain in a massive amount. It hijacks your brain's reward system so that it doesn't get pleasure from normal everyday activities like going to the ball game, getting ice cream, taking care of your responsibilities. Your brain is hijacked to want to get that drug in order to feel a reward. So, studies show that it affects the basal ganglia, which is habit forming, the prefrontal cortex, which is decision making. Your whole brain really is affected by drug abuse. And it's accepted widely in the medical community, the Mayo Clinic, the American Medical Association. Medical organizations across the country now accept it as a disease. It's labeled in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. It's a manual. It's abbreviated DSM-5. It's widely used among medical professionals, the legal system, pharmaceutical companies. It's classified as a disease, addiction. It's called substance use disorder. Matter of fact, right down the road at University of Michigan, Dr. Jillian Hardy, who's a neuroscientist, she really speaks on understanding addiction as a brain disease and how that can affect the negative stigma. And she really, emphasizes that treatment options and positive benefits can come from understanding it as a disease. Second way to reduce negative stigma is language. Words matter. There's a journal called Substance Abuse Treatment, Prevention, and Policy. They do a lot of clinical studies, trials, and editorials on how to combat addiction. They have an editorial that essentially says words matter. Negative stigma can be reduced by using language that doesn't dehumanize or demean an addict. Think of the mental image when you describe somebody with an addiction. When you use words like junkie, she's a junkie, a dope fiend, he's a dope fiend, or even addict, they're an addict. Contrast that with using words like, well, that's a person struggling with mental disease and substance use disorder, or that's a mother that is fighting against her addiction, or that's a man who has substance use disorder and is struggling. So the difference is the words don't dehumanize, they emphasize understanding and an empathetic approach. Using words that don't dehumanize and emphasize that approach can help reduce stigma and change perceptions. The last way to reduce the negative stigma, my research shows, is what I'm doing today: speaking out, being vocal, being open. Gary Mendel, he's a CEO of Shatterproof. It's a nationwide nonprofit that focuses on combating addiction and reducing stigma. He has an editorial for USA Today where he mentions that making addiction a national conversation can really prevent so much tragedy, and it can lead to widespread benefits across the country. So, reducing the negative stigma is important, and hopefully, I've given you three good ways that you can reduce the negative stigma. Understanding it as a brain disease, using language that is understanding and doesn't demean or dehumanize, and speaking out, seeking understanding, seeking empathy. I'm a drug addict of 10 years. It's very personal for me, but I have overcoming my addiction today. I'm a full-time student, a full-time employee, and a full-time dad to a 1-year-old boy. And I am doing my best today to overcome my addiction and do my part in reducing the negative stigma.